live.
Yeah.
So welcome to another episode of Unscripted, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Ken Munro. Thanks very much for joining me. Appreciate the time zone difference, and it's a Friday, and it's a short notice because we did talk about this for a little while, but life gets in the way. So before we get started, why don't we clean our palate just by walk me down memory lane, in terms of what you've been doing and what was your journey to where you are today?
Wow, that's a great question. So I have a confession. I made a mess of my degree at university. I studied applied physics, but didn't study enough, and my academic career came to a crashing end, which ended up me working in hotels and catering for a while. But then I found my way into cybersecurity back in the late 90s and have never looked back. I cannot think of a more interesting and environment that changes by the day.
Do you feel that, and this is a question that came about, so do you feel that since you messed up your degree, it's in hindsight, it's a motivator to become even better, to prove everyone wrong, and you've done very well for yourself as somebody who does some very significant high-level work around cybersecurity, but the fact that you didn't complete the degree, or you said you screwed it up, caused you to become even more tenacious about pursuing those goals.
Yeah, this is a great big chip on my shoulder right here.
Whatever that chip is, sometimes it's a driver, right?
Yeah, and I think it pushed me into what I genuinely love doing, is learning, which is ironic considering I made a mess of my degree. But what I truly adore about the field of cybersecurity is every day you learn something new. Every day you wake up, the world's changed slightly in the world of cybersecurity, and something that we weren't expecting happens. Yeah, it's stunning how, of all industries, this one changes every single day.
Yeah, and let's double click learning, right? Learning is, so the way that you've been taught in school, it's very structured mostly. There's you have to do certain types of assignments. You go through almost like a very structured path. But in cybersecurity, as you mentioned, there's learning, but it's different types of learning, I would say. A lot of it first of all, it has to be your own initiative, because even though there's stuff out there, as you mentioned, everything is new. And then you have to continuously pave your own path in terms of what it is that you want to learn. And then since the adversaries are changing and they're changing the methods and tactics, then you have to also change the way you perceive what's right and what's wrong to study. What's your take on the mechanism of learning how to become a cybersecurity expert?
That's a great question. I'm very lucky. I'm surrounded by an amazing team of very bright ethical hackers, pen testers, if you like, who are always very patient with me and take the time to explain some of the crazy things that they're working on. Yeah, so a lot of our team are really into embedded systems, so hardware devices, firmware, etc. And they've been super helpful in taking me down that journey. So yeah, I've started to understand and learn much more about the cybersecurity of microcontrollers. But I think the key is that inquisitive nature. Is want to understand why something works, and perhaps also how to stop it working and how to break it. I think that's really important, that inquisitive, why is it like that? Why does it do that way? And when could we make it do something else, maybe? Perhaps back to the true nature of hacking.
And Ken, do you remember the first days of how you came across this particular area, and what was the first aha moment when you came across something you deciphered and figured out?
Wow.
What it was?
I can think of two really big moments. I remember back in 2002 looking at a connected drinks vending machine that was connected over early cellular data, I think. And the idea was you could send an SMS from your cell phone, and it would cause the vending machine to vend a can of soda or whatever. And then there was back-end integration with the cell carrier, so they could charge to your bill. And I remember after a bit of investigation, we found we could make it vend and charge anybody, which was quite good fun. And it's how do you make that thing give you what you need? Almost back to the early days of phone phreaking, right? That's way before my time. But yeah, how do you achieve something? Another seminal moment I remember looking in, must have been 2006, 7, looking at some very early building management controllers. It's one of the very first embedded devices I was ever given to have a play with, and being blown away at how far back certain embedded devices were in terms of basic security standards. Even web applications at the time were way more advanced than this. Then you look at the embedded web servers running there and go, hey, this is like 2002 all over again. So, yeah, that was a building management controller that was controlling the security doors at an airport. So, not a great day.
Yeah, and it's quite incredible that we rely so heavily on IoT devices in our day-to-day life. Anything we touches upon on a regular basis has quite a few chips in it, and it becomes even more universal, right? And it seems like it's just like the early days of driving vehicles that were going 60 miles an hour, in your case, 100 kilometers an hour without seatbelts. We are, relatively speaking, we're doing the same. We're using fairly sophisticated devices, and even though you mentioned these IoT, they still have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines of codes, and potentially a processor, and potentially the ability to connect to the outside world, just like a vending machine. But yet, there's very little oversight from a security perspective in the design of the chips and the design of the hardware and the software. Are we going 60 miles an hour without seatbelts right now? When are we going to design the seatbelts for all these IoT devices?
That's a really good point. I think a lot of the challenges was many of the entrepreneurs who started out in IoT, they were trying to move fast and get first mover advantage, but maybe they'd come from perhaps one of the previous growth areas of mobile apps. And if you made a cybersecurity mistake on a mobile app, it wasn't the end of the world because you could just push out an update, right? And everyone would date their app and the vulnerability is gone. The problem with moving fast in embedded systems is if you're not, it's not as easy to update, particularly if you haven't chosen the right microcontrollers. You haven't got an architecture in place that allows an over-the-air update. And you've also got to remember that when you build hardware, you're probably booking space on the production line 6 to 9 months in advance. So it can be really difficult if you've backed yourself into an architectural corner to then push out updates. And a lot of the early IoT devices we looked at, we found serious cybersecurity flaws in them, and they couldn't be fixed. There was no method, no mechanism to provide an over-the-air update. So the devices were vulnerable and stayed vulnerable. So you're really letting the consumer down there. So are we traveling at 60 miles an hour? Certainly we were. I think things are improving a bit now. There's been quite a bit of regulation coming now. There's been a big piece of legislation published recently in the USA, which includes things like cybersecurity labeling, which is a really good idea. So the consumers can choose devices that are appropriate for their concerns and risks. There's been a big move in the EU as well. So are we finally seeing those seatbelts? Yeah, I think we slowly are.
Yeah, and I'll come down to this labeling thing because it's super interesting. But coming back to these devices, so isn't it a bit of a security by obscurity? Meaning, since it's not totally trivial to take a vending machine and trying to hack it, not everybody has a vending machine in their backyard or the ability to even reach out to something like that. Isn't that makes it a little bit of a secure because there's not a lot of people that would try and get these devices and try to hack them? Or you have to have, first of all, you have to get your hold of one of these devices. Secondly, now you have to have the know-how to figure out, and then potentially say, okay, you get free soda, free pop. What do you care?
Who cares?
Not everybody's going to do that.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point with IoT. It was a game changer because the hacker, the attacker, the researcher could go onto eBay/Amazon, wherever, and buy the product. And now it's in your hands, and now you can take it apart. So that was a game changer. But you're right. Someone still had to make that financial investment to go and buy that product. But we talk in IoT about what we call break once, run everywhere attacks, or BOR for short. And that's the problem, is once someone's broken it, it's now everywhere. So it just takes someone prepared to invest a bit of time and effort and maybe a little bit of cash and you've now got a vulnerability that's trivial to replicate. And so that causes all sorts of problems in automotive, actually, particularly around automotive theft. It might involve a very great degree of skill to actually reverse engineer some cryptography and allow a microcontroller or ECU on the vehicle to be compromised and then the vehicle security systems disable. But the problem is it's the same on every vehicle. So once you've broken once, that can then be commoditized, then be productized, and then you run everywhere and an entire brand of vehicles get stolen.
So should eBay have one of these disclaimer forms when you buy an IoT device and say, hey, I'm buying this for the purpose of not reverse engineer and try to hack it. I'm just buying it for my own use. Should be like some regulation around who
Yeah. I swear I won't.
I swear I won't gonna try to hack this device. Maybe there's some regulation there as well. You tell me if that's something that is even enforceable. Probably not.
I don't think it is, and again, the problem is it would be wonderful to have regulation that maybe prevented that, but of course you then start to get in the way of right to repair. Reverse engineering isn't illegal in a lot of countries. In the UK, reverse engineering isn't illegal as long as you don't use it for nefarious purposes. In the EU, again, reverse engineering is perfectly legitimate in most of the countries. So it makes it very difficult because all the hacker would do is place themselves into a territory where it was legal. And are the sort of organizations that are reversing car security systems to enable theft really that bothered about the law? I'm not so sure.
And so we've seen these IoT devices in all different industries. So from medical to aviation to the car industry to retail. Is there anybody in particular that you feel is more advanced in terms of protections, in terms of putting these mechanisms in place to make sure that these devices are safe? Or they're all moving the same direction all the time?
It's a really difficult one, that actually. There are certainly organizations that are more motivated, perhaps through early regulation or early oversight or early supply chain requirements. Certainly we're seeing a lot of progress in OT right now. So a lot of utilities are starting to figure out that if they put in cybersecurity requirements in their procurement contracts, that they tend to get more robust product. Consumer IoT, it's a bit of the Wild West right now, I'm afraid. It can be quite variable and also quite hard to determine what is and what isn't robust. Auto manufacturers are getting a whole lot better. And a big hat tip to Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, who did the Jeep hack back in, I think, 2015, and woke the whole industry up to the fact that it is possible to hack a car. And that's set up a train of cybersecurity improvements to the point where most vehicles now are much, much more robust and much more resistant to compromise. One area I'd like to call out, actually, not necessarily in terms of pure cybersecurity, is one of aviation. And the thing I love about aviation is their safety culture. And there's this wonderful culture that's been built in since the very beginning, as if there's an incident, if there's a crash, if there's a near crash, if there's a safety incident, it's written up and it's published and shared without blame. And can you imagine how much better cybersecurity would be for all of us on the ground, on our ground systems, if every incident got written up without blame and everyone could learn from it? What a wonderful thing. And that's why airplanes are so safe, because every time something happens or there's a near miss or a safety incident, we publish it, we share it, we learn, and everyone goes, oh, crikey, yes, I should check my own systems to make sure that happens. And as a result, people, the loss rate on airplanes is tiny now by comparison to 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and maybe it's a good segue to get into the airline, the aviation security. So first and foremost, let me concur in terms of the safety. People are not aware how many airplanes are in the sky at any given moment. It's staggering amount. And it's actually much safer to get on the plane than there is to actually get in your car and drive, statistically speaking. And then if you look at the vast amount of components of each, not just the plane itself, but the ground crew, the digital system, the booking systems, we're all moving toward digital experience quote unquote. There's just so many. There's millions of moving parts, yet and we do hear some every once in a while. We hear some glitch in the system, and there's some conspiracy theories in terms of how that happened. But overall, you're right. There's movement towards the right place of being secure. But with that said, there's some major challenges. I can see right now, for example, aside from the complexity, there's complexity around supply chain. For example, there's just so many different suppliers. So the move towards, as I mentioned, toward digitalization of the user experience, the self service, even that causes, you know, issues, or the attack surface is getting larger and larger. Can you talk to me about the airlines? So first of all, you touch upon the culture and how great it is towards making the more secure industry as a whole. But what else do they do to make sure that the airlines industry stays secure?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, actually. So typically in the past, an airplane, when it took off, it was in the air and you could only talk to it by VHF radio. And for obvious reasons of efficiency, so even something as simple as the least cost routing, so you get the best tailwinds, you'd ideally want to be able to communicate with the airplane in a digital manner. So you could do things like monitor the engines. So if something's not quite right, you can get it fixed proactively next time it lands. Or if the engine's not quite performing, you've got another one ready to go. So that predictive maintenance is really powerful in terms of ensuring that your airplane dispatches on time every single time. And that's really cool. But that requires connectivity. It used to be really expensive to get SATCOMs, so it was only reserved for the captain in very special moments because it costs so much money to do SATCOM comms. But now we have VSAT, we have downward-facing LTE over ground, so connectivity is hugely available and cheap. And the aviation industry rightly uses that to drive efficiency and economy and reduce their carbon emissions, which is all great, right? Because that means that our flight tickets are cheaper and our flights go on time. But as we start to connect airplanes and as we start to connect the systems that make them more efficient to dispatch, that's when we start to see interesting opportunities. And that's what we spent the last 4 to 5 years researching. There was this really weird, if you can call it, silver lining from COVID, where a lot of airplanes got retired earlier than expected. And that meant the boneyards, the breakers yards, got backed up. We have 3 in the UK. And we saw they were absolutely full. So we rang one and said, hey, what happens to those airplanes? They said, well, they're never flying again. We can't break them for 3 or 4 years because we can only do one a month. We said, hey, if we give you some cash to power the power units, can we have a go? And they said, yeah, come along. It's never going to fly again. You're not going to do anything bad. So as a result of that, we managed to do some vanilla research on multi-million-dollar airplanes that were never going to fly again.
That's incredible.
We learned huge. We had a lot of fun learning how airplanes are. I'm a pilot, a general aviation pilot. A couple of my colleagues are. We have some aeronautical engineers on the team, and commercial pilots too. And we've learned so much about airplane cybersecurity. And of course, the big question is, can you hack a plane? And the answer is no, although I would put a little asterisk by that. So there are some edge cases which I think really hang off some of the connectivity systems that airplanes are now using. But in honesty, I wouldn't attack the plane. I wouldn't bother attacking the plane. I would do is if I would go for the ground systems. I would go for the things on the ground that make sure the planes all go on time. And yeah, there was a funny example. It was a pretty bad if you were at the airport that day. But one of the US operators lost its weather feed to the flight bag, so the tablets that the pilots use, and they lost the weather. And you might like, it's the weather. I'll look out the window, right? Well, yeah, except you need to know what the weather's like up there, what it's like at your destination. You need to know all these things. So actually losing your weather feed stopped all the airplanes going. So a simple system outage stopped, I think, that day 1,700 airplanes moving.
So
that's right. The interesting side is.
So there's this notion of redundancy, right? There's the redundant systems on the plane. So it should be a redundant systems on the ground as well, as you mentioned, or the ability to have redundancy on the digital services provided.
Yeah, so you're right. So on an airplane, absolutely, there are multiple redundant systems. And a good example, there'll always be 3 sets of flight control systems. There'll be 3 sets of flight management computers, 3 sets of autopilots. And the idea is typically they vote And if two of them say it's this way and one says something else, we'll go with the majority decision. And over the years, there's been a tiny number of issues caused by voting. Far more flights were kept safe by that voting system. But having three is great, right? That's not quite so often the case on ground systems. So being able to have a live system that fails over seamlessly is a very expensive thing to do. But when those systems do go down and you don't have a live redundant backup, that can be a real problem.
So they don't subscribe to the saying that two is a company, three is a crowd, type of thing.
Right? Yeah. There was another interesting incident, actually. This one got a lot of press coverage. I believe one of the chart or the map providers for a lot of airlines, they had a corruption problem. You might remember, I think it was the approach chart. So that's the instructions on how you approach and land at an airport. There was a duplication at the same time of some changes, I think, made at Reagan National Airport in DC. And the chart system should only ever have one chart for each airport or for each approach. And there was an update applied that meant there were two. And as a result, the application crashed. And that meant that the pilots, because they don't carry paper anymore, didn't know how to conduct the approach safely. So usually in that case, you go to a radar-based talk down, but that's really time-consuming and slows the number of arrivals. So all of a sudden, you're trying to land, and the system, your application on your tablet that tells you how you fly that approach isn't there anymore. So it can really cause problems.
I imagine it's so stressful to the pilots of flying these planes. Do they go through, out of curiosity, I'm assuming they go through debriefing and briefing before flights on an annual basis, on a regular basis. They go through simulators and so on. Do they ever simulate, like, quote unquote, cyber attack or down systems where they're doing a case scenarios of tabletop exercises of things that are not necessarily completely related to the airline controls or the throttle getting stuck, but it's specifically, as you mentioned, the system basically was taken out of service.
So that's really interesting. Commercial pilots go through sim checks, so they have to revalidate their currency and show that they can cope with a number of incidents in flight. And those sort of checks might involve a system outage. They might involve having to land in heavy turbulence, just prove they've got the skills. Now, to my knowledge, I don't believe there are any operators that train for cyber incidents, at least not the air crews anyway. There are some wonderful organizations, like the Aviation ISAC, for example, do some amazing tabletop exercises for ground and dispatch systems and really exercise people's processes to make sure that, if it does go down. But I'm not familiar or aware with significant cybersecurity training in operators for the air crew themselves. And the sort of research that we've done is more about trying to feed pilots the wrong information through vulnerabilities in various of the information systems they use. So a good example is when you take off in an airplane, in a jet airplane, it's very rare you use full power. You don't want to do that because it causes wear on the engine, you use a lot of fuel, and it also pumps out a lot of carbon dioxide. So it's not a good thing. So you'll do what's called a performance or perf calculation. So that's basically a series of inputs, lots and lots of different data that you bring onto your electronic flight bag. So it's a calculator, and it works out things like how long's my runway, how heavy is my airplane, how high am I, what's the temperature outside, what's the wind doing, all these sort of calculations. And it tells you how much power you need to take off safely from that runway. And we found vulnerabilities that would allow us to, in certain cases, tamper with that information. So the pilots might inadvertently set too little power. Now, again, good news is we found those vulnerabilities early. We gave them to the manufacturers and the airlines and said, hey, you need to be aware of this. And they got fixed, which is great. So that when you're sat at the end of the runway next time, you're going like, I hear the throttle's going up, but it's the right amount of power. But it's very interesting that we found bugs in the first place.
This is so interesting. Do the pilot know that potentially they have to trust the instrumentation, but maybe verify, or if it doesn't make sense, don't blindly follow? Because I've personally seen a case where the air crew was looking at I think it was the altitude meter basically, and it was wrong with something, and then the plane ended up crashing, even though everything was fine. It just showed the, the wrong instrumentation. Bottom line, are they aware that something like this can happen? And
so the big thing when you're flying, that's why you have two pilots, right? Is cross checks. Is you have someone looks at some information, interprets it, and then cross checks it with the co-pilot or the captain, and that's brilliant because it shows lots of redundancy, not only in systems but also in people.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are so many flights going. Occasionally, things happen, and it's most of the times those cascades we talk about, where one thing leads to another, they just stop. It's not a problem. The good procedures by great, well-trained pilots stop that happening. But just occasionally, something happens, something that the pilot is influenced into a series of decisions that then result in a safety case. Very rare they lead to true accidents. I can think of only one crash involving fatalities, which was due to a problem with the performance calculation. And even that wasn't a hack. It was just the pilot got the numbers wrong and was so tired, and the co-pilot was tired too. And they didn't pick it up. And that very sadly led to a crash of a freight airplane. But I think what's great is being able to actually pick up on these vulnerabilities and find them soon and get them out to industry. And industry goes, hey, yes, we agree with you. And actually, there's a wonderful case of a bug we found in a Boeing tool that was used for calculating this. And Boeing were super. They were really cool. We dropped them a line and said, hey, we found something. What do you think? They came back and said, give us 24 hours. And we did. They came back and said, yeah, we agree with you. Okay. Let's get this fixed.
That is pretty amazing for a company that size.
Oh, incredible.
So you have a kind of a really sweet spot, really cool cross section of being a pilot, commercial pilot, and then have the ability to understand cybersecurity and IoT. Do you find that cross section is required these days? You can't have a pure knowledge of cybersecurity without having a knowledge of the specific industry that you are working on, because that cross section is really the kind of the value add where the magic happens for you.
It's that magic word, isn't it? Context. How do we assess risk without understanding context? And one of the things I learned, sat down with a commercial pilot, is I hadn't appreciated that a certain system was used in a certain way and wasn't cross-checked in a certain way. And all of a sudden, I realized there was a potential to inject a security problem because I now had context. And I think that's so important. It's really important to understand how data influences certain businesses, certain industries, certain organizations. We've been doing some work in food manufacturing process control recently. And would it matter if an ingredient was moved slightly? And actually, yeah, in the case of producing alcohol, for example, it doesn't take much to change the fermentation process and produce something that's toxic. So context to me is absolutely everything. And you're right. I think it's really important to bring together expertise in a sector together with expertise in cyber.
And how would you recommend to somebody who's listening now and they know cybersecurity, they know it really well, and then potentially they're either in a SOC or they work for a company, how do you recommend that they venture into a particular vertical to, again, get that magic, get that value added and that context? Should they just go out, like in your case, get a pilot license? Should they work a food manufacturer? Do they go into medical device manufacturer? Because we need more of these people like yourself that have the domain expertise in different areas.
I've got one thought which I'm passionate about, which is I am a huge supporter of DEF CON and the villages around DEF CON. And that's where, for example, in the aerospace village, we bring together security researchers, we bring together the aviation industry, and we bring together stuff for people to play with and learn about, give talks. But there are similar villages. So the car hacking village at DEF CON, very similar things. Some car manufacturers bring entire cars there and you get to play with them. And it allows, I think, researchers to start understanding context. It's very difficult to justify buying an entire car just to hack it and break it, right? But when industries collaborating, all of a sudden those barriers are reduced. Yeah, I can't afford to go and buy an entire airplane, right? I don't have $50 million sat in my pocket, right?
It's amazing that you did the 1+1 and you went to the
Yeah.
junkyard.
And the same
Yeah.
thing. I think the villages, the communities that are popping up around B-Sides, DEF CON, Black Hat, I think they're fantastic. And I strongly encourage anyone who has the time is to get involved in some of those industry communities, because that's where I think, for me, the magic happens. That's where expertise in cyber comes together with expertise in the industry, and really cool stuff happens. A great example being the biohacking village at DEF CON. That's where medtech manufacturers bring stuff and they let people hack it, and that produces context. And I love that.
Since you're in the right spot to maybe answer this question, I've been watching lately quite a few versions of the Air Malaysia 370. And there's all these scenarios. There was a Netflix show, and there's a lot of YouTubers out there that create some content around that. So from your perspective, and they show, just like you described, the ability for the airplane to be in contact with the outside world through like various means, satellite communication, ground control, and so on. Do you have a theory of what happened there? And then potentially, as you mentioned, since the airline is a very great industry to internalize what happened and potentially doing post-mortem events. So did anything change after this particular event from a procedural perspective?
Well,
I know it's a big question, and I didn't prepare you for it. Okay.
No, that's a really good question. It's that particular documentary series. If you haven't watched it, the MH370 incident. There are 3 episodes to that documentary. The first one is, I think, the most widely accepted thought process, which was a pilot's murder-suicide, which was awful, but it stacks up with the evidence available. The second episode, now this is nuts, by the way. I'm due to speak to the journalist who wrote this next. I have a call next.
No way.
Yeah, it's a guy called Jeff Wise. He's really cool. He's an aviator himself. But the second episode was one. Before I'd spoken to him, I got quite shouty. I got mad at my TV because it talks about a Russian special ops hack where they managed to get inside the avionics bay and reprogram the flight controls to fly north and reprogram the SATCOM to show it flying south. And my team and I, we have a good knowledge of avionics systems and how the cybersecurity works, but more so, we've got a good understanding of how airplanes work. And there was just too much, even for a well-funded nation-state actor. The suggestion there was a Russian special ops team that was trying to distract from the invasion of Crimea in 2014. It just doesn't add up technically. Even something as simple as, if let's say they had compromised the flight control system and caused the airplane to turn without the pilots controlling it, there's a nuance of the autopilots and the flight controls in the 777. So believe it or not, even though it's fly-by-wire, there are actually mechanical interconnections to some of the flight control surfaces. So the pilots could still make it go back the other way to a point.
This is part of the redundancy we talked about, right?
So even if you lost all of your electronic systems on that airplane, within reason, you still have a degree of mechanical control, so you can still make the plane turn left and right. So the pilots could have overwhelmed it. The degree of complexity involved in reprogramming the avionics is insane. And they also chose the wrong airplane too, because the 777 is a bit unique too, because it uses a flight control protocol that's different to everything else. It was a different protocol that was introduced just for the 777 to try and save the miles and miles of wiring, but it never made it mainstream after 777. All the manufacturers took a different turn and implemented, believe it or not, an Ethernet-based protocol that is used on the Airbus A380, the Boeing 787, and some other types. So I got mad at my TV for that one.
And there was also a scenario where the CIA hijacked remotely and diverted it through remote control means.
Yeah,
it's all kinds of.
Yeah, I don't find that plausible. yes, you could do things like influence the information displayed to a pilot. So, for example, on their cockpit display units, that's the keyboard thing that sits next to the throttles. You could, without too much difficulty, send the pilots a different flight plan, and they'd probably just accept it. They're supposed to check it, but why would it be wrong? And there have been a few cases where the wrong flight plan was sent to an airplane. It went the wrong way, and it took a good hour for the pilots to notice they were flying out over the Mid-Atlantic instead of over Europe. But hey, that's another story. You could influence airplanes in that way, but just a radio-based hack taking control of the flight systems, no.
Yeah, it's quite incredible to see the redundancy in everything. Even like there was a section there where the co-pilot was trying to get into. There's a code on the door where you put a code in, and then the pilot has to authorize it. But then there's another code that requires, basically allows for 30 seconds time delay, and then that would also, the pilot has to specifically prevent that from happening. There's just so many redundancies associated with, in particular, with the procedures on the plane itself.
The only way you're getting in if the pilot in the cockpit doesn't want you to get in is you've probably got to go through the side. The doors are bulletproof, they're everything proof for good reason, right? If the pilot doesn't want you in there because they've got other plans, you're not getting in there quickly.
Yeah, and then it was remarkable to see the satellite communication, the ability to triangulate using how long it takes between the communications being sent over and back and forth. So does the airline now have, in your knowledge, they've created a new procedures, or did they implement yet another system to prevent something like that from ever happening again? Or is this just one-off?
There's a couple of simple things. Is certainly for a period of time, no one pilot would be left alone in the cockpit. We had an incident in the UK where a co-pilot, very sadly, once the pilot had gone to use the restroom, took control of the plane and crashed it and killed everyone aboard, which was awful. And it's likely that, in our opinion, that the MH370 incident was caused through similar issues. Operating procedures have changed so that a single pilot wasn't left alone in the cockpit. And there's always the debate is, should we allow remote control of the plane in that situation? But of course, the challenges that would open up in terms of consciously allowing someone external to take control of the plane are just so big.
Yeah, you increase the attack surface tenfold.
Exactly. I am so comfortable as a passenger knowing there are two people up front who've got a vested interest in staying alive too. Is a really powerful thing.
And from a regulatory compliance perspective, I know here in the US, for example, the airlines is considered an industry where top priority is one of the industries that are in a critical infrastructure, they call it, right? And so the critical infrastructure now has to comply with certain regulations that are, it means a lot. They have to look into supply chain and the way they do procedures and so on. So is that also evolving as we speak? There are just continuous regulation. And I know you have some say in that, or you have the ability to affect some of those regulations in terms of what you do. Maybe you can talk to me about that.
By some coincidence, I was briefing the FAA just yesterday, and they are very advanced in their cybersecurity awareness, which is great. And they ask a lot of industry in terms of demonstrating cybersecurity compliance, which is great. And that's how it should be, right? I was asked to brief the TSA three weeks before. And again, they're spending a lot of time looking at how the 440 commercial airports in the USA actually maintain their cybersecurity. So there's a lot of good oversight there. And as a result, that means that hacking airplanes, airports is not an easy thing to do anymore. Yeah, there's always a road to travel. There's always a way to improve. But actually, the fact that we're going down the right road in the right way, I think really gives me a lot of confidence as a traveling passenger.
And that also true for the whole drone industry, right? We've seen some, and I want to get into that too, because I have a commercial drone licensed pilot, and there's some areas there, and it's regulated by the FAA as well. You have to go through an exam, and you have to know they treat drones very much like regular planes, just unmanned. Is it still Wild West in the drone? Because it was for a while there, and they so it started to clamp onto it. What's your take on the particular drone cybersecurity area?
Yeah, in the UK, so we've regulated around certain size drones. So if it's a little itty bitty drone, then hey, whatever. If it's a bigger drone, then just as in the US, there's been similar regulation in place, which is the right thing to do, to my mind. The challenge has been we had a quite a serious incident at one of our airports in the UK where someone said they saw a drone. There was no evidence to suggest there actually was a drone, but someone said they had, and because we weren't ready to prove there was or wasn't, one of our major airports got shut for a number of hours, and it caused chaos. In hindsight, I believe it was someone crying wolf. However, how do you prove it's not in such a safety critical industry as aviation? And I think that flagged up some really interesting opportunities for disruption of our airports. And now, one of the systems that we use for tracking airplanes is called ADS-B. And if you ever look at like flight radar, flight tracking websites, that's what they use. They use public ADS-B to show you where all the airplanes are, and that's great. But we also use that for tracking ground-side vehicles. So all the baggage carts, all the tugs, the trucks that go around, they all have ADS-B transponders on them as well. And one of the crazy things you can do with ADS-B is you can spoof it very easily. It's not a protected protocol. Now, of course, if ADS-B said there was a truck on the middle of the runway, you'd look out the window and go, hey, no truck, we're fine. But what about if it was a foggy day? So the airplanes can still land because they've got automated landing systems. How do you go out and prove there isn't a truck on the runway? So I think there's real potential to do something like that. The reason I raise it is because larger drones, we're increasingly seeing are mandated to have ADS-B on as well. So not difficult to spoof in a low visibility environment and cause chaos at an airport.
And then I think the government was looking into banning DJI because of the Chinese components and the Chinese manufacturing. And I know they've done some of that stuff for networking equipment, for example, that's being used by the Department of Defense and so on. And I'm assuming there's a lot of components on the planes that are manufactured by external different states. Is that something that somebody's looking closely as well, like the ability to potentially either siphon information or change the bits, as you mentioned?
There's more of a problem in counterfeit parts in aviation. So obviously buying components from the original manufacturer, from the Boeings, the Airbuses, etc., it's expensive because they go through a very tight certification process. There are cases where we see counterfeit parts. Obviously, they're much cheaper for the operator, but aren't necessarily subject to the same degree of certification and testing. So there is a cybersecurity issue around there. And I do wonder in time if we might start to see digital components counterfeited, and we might start to see digital systems from grey markets, shall we say. So that's one that does start to bother me. Maybe one for the future.
Or parts being stolen. Like I know in the US there's a problem with catalysts, right? In the vehicles where it gets stolen and then they sell it in the gray market. They do that with the heavy machinery as well. The construction site, you steal a pump from a John Deere or whatever, it's $100,000. Is that also something that's happening in the industry, like in the airline, where somebody comes over to the plane and steals like a certain component and then try to sell it in a different marketplace? So that
we have the benefit of physical security at airports. It's not always perfect. It's a heck of a lot better than most places right at. So there's guards, there's fences, there's CCTV, which is all great. One of the areas why I think you're right, and it might start to increase, is because some of the sanctions that are being applied to Russia right now. So a lot of Russian operators, the airlines, they can't get hold of spares anymore. And there's some papers out there suggesting that half of the Aeroflot fleet are grounded right now and being cannibalized for spares to keep the others going, which is why I think there's probably much more of an incentive for parts to be stolen from airplanes around the world and other places to keep that Russian fleet flying. So it's something of a geopolitical game changer, and I think part theft has potential to increase.
Yeah, absolutely. In in the grand scheme of things, the interconnectivity of the airline industry with the ground crew and the consumers and so on is ever increasing. Do you find there any particular best best strategies to deal with that complexity and make it more secure? You obviously you consult to some airlines and pretty serious companies like, so they come back and say, hey, listen, we have all the complexity. We are running 100 miles an hour trying to make the experience better. And there's almost an economy between the two. Like, how do we make it everything super connected to increase productivity, efficiencies, and user experience on one side, and then on the other side, you got the nightmarish of connectivity. And they come back to you and say, Ken, what should we do?
It's a problem across many industries, isn't it? Is the innovators that they want to find great new ways of generating revenue and providing new services, right? And you've got the cybersecurity people going, "Hey, Ken, slow down, slow down." So I think the real key there is engaging early. And I think it's really important that the cyber teams are seen as business partnering. Yes, we can do that if, rather than going, hey, no, you can't do that. I think that's really important. A problem we see in aviation is people wanting to improve cockpit efficiency, improve reliability and dispatch, but not always having the conversation with the people using the devices that will make them efficient. So we've seen a lot of breakdowns in ground-based IT providers not understanding how pilots work. And I'll give you a good example of this. So that tablet that you see the pilot using, which is critical to several stages of flight, on the ground, if you were going to lock down, so I don't know, your tablet, your phone, your cell phone, you'd probably go, hey, let's use Face ID, right? So we use biometrics. Brilliant. It doesn't work in the cockpit. And I'll tell you why. Is when you're flying, a lot of pilots like to wear mirrored sunglasses, right? And I tell you, Face ID does not work with mirrors very well. And there's another safety case too. Let's say the airplane has an emergency depressurization. Now, oxygen masks come down, and you've got about 10 minutes to get down to about 12,000 feet where you can breathe the air. But in the meantime, the pilot's just put on an oxygen mask. How are you going to unlock your electronic flight bag with an oxygen mask on your face? You see, quite often we find that there's a breakdown between the ground enterprise IT systems and the people trying to help configure and secure things, and the people actually on the flight line who are going to be using these things. To answer your question, I would always say the best thing to do is engage really early in a project.
Yeah, and then plan for particular scenarios, as you mentioned. When the masks come down, maybe there's going to be a secondary or tertiary methods of unlocking, maybe your fingerprint or even the way you move. There's all kinds of different biometrics, right? So tell me, Ken, when you get on the plane, and I'm sure this happens quite often, and you see the infotainment system boot up. Have you seen that before, right?
Oh, yeah.
It gets stuck. And then it starts showing you like the Linux kernel and all that, because it does. It shows you all that components running. Do you pay attention to that very closely and you say, hey, this is probably not right? I could probably take a video of the boot up.
Yeah.
And then I now have some serious information in particular about the infotainment system.
Yeah. So in-flight entertainment systems are interesting. The first thing is obviously everything that's in the passenger cabin is fundamentally considered dirty in terms of cyber by the manufacturers. And I think I agree with that. There is very strong segregation between those systems and the flight control systems, to the point that it used to be a one-way data diode. So you could just get the airspeed and the altitude. You couldn't get data back the other way. So if you hack the IFE, so what? What's going to happen? I don't know. You might irritate people because it doesn't work on a long-haul flight. There's no entertainment. Irritating, but it's going to be a compensation issue, not maybe a bit of bad public relations, right? Maybe, I don't know, some bright spark. Let's put some pornography on everyone's screen. Okay, that's a bad PR day, but it's not a safety case, right? And that's not what's really important to me. Now, we've had access to in-flight entertainment systems. We found new vulnerabilities in them. We made them play some stuff they weren't supposed to play, but so what? It was one of the systems was on a retired 747, and the platform was 27 years old. So, yeah, what chance for it being safe and cyber secure? But that said, we also looked at a much more recent 747 that had been retired, and it was retired at the beginning of COVID, and it just had its IFE refitted. So it was quite current. And we found some bugs in that, and we could make it play some things it shouldn't. But,
and in terms of the ability for people to, I mean, everybody has their phone and immediately like just shows up and social media. And what happened is, unfortunately, a lot of it can be collected and be viewed as OSINT, open source intelligence, meaning that you take the images of the tail numbers and where you are and potentially procedural security controls that are being published out there. Is the airline mindful of that, of what is being released? And sometimes it's not maliciously, it's just somebody taking the selfie and then in the back there's just diagram of whatever. So is there something that the airline is doing to look at that and control it?
Not so much. So I'm always interested when I'm on a flight. I always want to go and have a conversation with the crew, and I particularly want to understand more about the flight attendants panels, the panels at the back where they turn the lights on. Some of those do more, and I'm always intrigued to see what the crews know about them and how they work. Some of the most recent models I haven't had access to have a good look at those systems, and obviously I'd never do that without permission. But it's always interesting to chat to the crews to see what they know and what they understand. Yeah, do you know what? It passes the time on a flight too. So I'm your worst passenger.
What about hacking all those loyalty systems, right? Everybody wants to get to the 1,000,000-mile mark and get upgraded to better seats. Are the airlines worried about that? Is that something that they're continuously looking at?
Very much so.
Yeah.
It's considered a revenue system, right? So it's really important. They spend a lot of time making sure that their revenue systems are really robust. In a kind of related way, there's one cool thing that one airline did. So actually United did a really cool thing. They set up a bug bounty program. So if you found a vulnerability, a security flaw in one of their ground-based systems, their booking platforms, for example, you got some loyalty miles. And I thought that was a really cool idea. So it was like, it was engaging, it was rewarding people for doing the right thing, for reporting vulnerabilities, sharing them. And actually, do you know what? Everyone benefited. United got some nice loyal passengers, and they got to find some vulnerabilities in their systems, and they got fixed quickly. So what a cool idea, hey?
So now you have maybe caused a lot of people walking around with pineapple computers in the airport trying to do like a hotspot to try to get some miles out of it. I mean, who knows where this thing goes after the fact? Beware for what you wish for. Ken, let me ask you this, and I feel like we could probably do one more session, and I haven't even dived into some of the IoT questions. But I like to wrap up with some positive tone always, even though we're dealing with some pretty serious topics. The sky is not falling, right? And pun intended, in terms of the cybersecurity area and vulnerability in IoT specifically. What are the kind of the positive things you've seen in the industry in terms of change, in terms of where we're going, and making all of us more secure?
So particularly in aviation, I've seen over the last 4 to 5 years an enormous drive to look at the connectivity and then start questioning the cybersecurity of it. Again, organizations like the Aviation ISAC are doing a really good job of bringing the community together, bringing industry together, and everyone's learning. If someone makes a mistake, we can all learn from that, which is fantastic. So I have far more confidence in the cybersecurity of airplanes now than I did, say, 4 to 5 years ago. I'm a very comfortable airline passenger now, which is great. But I also think that there's a little bit of oversight, and I think we've seen that in IoT, as I mentioned at the beginning. There are some industries like IoT that perhaps not all the manufacturers take cybersecurity as well as seriously as they might. And I think that's where some regulations really helped us too. So the US took a little while to regulate, but they've done it. And I really like what the regulation's doing, is it's forcing manufacturers who we're sharing our data with to treat that data carefully and not do anything that might invade our privacy. And I think that's a really big win.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to vote for bringing back the glamour in flying. You have to look at the early 50s, 60s. It's pretty amazing. Everybody wore like they were like going out for a wedding, and I think it was super cool. I think we should all vote to get that back into. So Ken, thank you very much. Before we part ways, I want to just plug in you, the company. Tell me about how can people reach you. What's your ideal customer or prospect or somebody that you like to deal with on a regular? Obviously, you have a lot on your plate, but love to have a plug in for what you do in the company as well.
Oh, for sure. So the firm is called Pen Test Partners. So we're pen testers, obviously, Pen Test Partners. We operate in financial services and aviation and utilities and related industries. We've got a big team. We're one of the largest in the UK, although we also have an operation in New Jersey now. So we have a team out there and have been coming out and doing briefings in the USA. So I hope that sometime soon we'll be able to come to a face-to-face briefing for you at your event. Really looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Maybe I'll bring my drone over. We'll do a quick flyby.
What could go wrong?
I'll let your team try to see if there's something they can do with it to try to maybe take control over it or whatnot. But until then, thank you all for everyone who joined. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next episode. And until then, stay safe online as well as on the ground and in the air. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.